I'm going to be talking to Stewart Prest, who's a political scientist from the University of British Columbia, about very disturbing moves by U.S. President Donald Trump in the way he is deploying National Guard units and the U.S. military as part of domestic policing. So, welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Good to be here. Thank you, Mark.
Look, when Donald Trump became president on January 20th, and it wasn't long after that, there was talk of, Canada should become the 51st state. And there was even talk for a while about invading Canada, which just seemed, it was so bizarre you couldn't wrap your head around it. But now what we're seeing down, the way Trump is operating in his own country, which is basically deploying federal military resources against democratic controlled cities, you know, maybe Canada should start having the conversation about what we do if he turns his attention northward.
I think we have been consistently underestimating how far things can go from what we tend to think of as being the norm in politics, and indeed the extent to which this administration in the United States is willing to challenge political norms. So anytime we say, well, that can't happen because things have never been done that way. Well, if that's the only reason why they haven't happened, then we have to expect that perhaps they will happen differently going forward. So in the United States, for instance, right now, we see relatively small numbers of troops being deployed, but we see National Guard troops being deployed or attempted to be deployed in specific states to try to respond to claims of emergency that actually don't hold up to close scrutiny. So these are effectively deployments of National Guard troops on pretext towards cities that, as you say, are under the control of or governed by, is probably a better way to say it, Democratic mayors in states that are governed by Democratic governors and so on. And so that means places like Oregon and Chicago and California. And that is a worrisome development, a much greater willingness to use the power of the federal government to achieve President Trump's ends.
Yeah, there was over the last few days, there's been some a development down in Oregon and California in that Trump tried to deploy Oregon National Guard in Oregon, and that was struck down by a judge. So then he turned around and ordered California National Guards units into Oregon, which is apparently a much fuzzier constitutional concept and denounced by Governor Gavin Newsom in California. And so, I mean, this seems to be his MO, which is push, push, push. What can I get away with? And he doesn't stop until he comes up against an obstacle that's maybe too big for him.
Yeah. There are many areas of presidential authority in the United States that have not been fully mapped out in terms of their limits. And that's particularly true whenever we talk about states of emergency. So once the president declares a state of emergency, the standard rules regarding checks and balances and the ability of either Congress or the judiciary to hold the office of the president and the executive branch to account are attenuated and not fully mapped out. And generally speaking, these situations have persisted because there's been an assumption that the president is going to be the most trustworthy person in the room. And it's the same reason why the president is the keeper of the nuclear codes, because in an emergency, when you need to respond quickly, it's most likely to be the most trustworthy person in the room. But if that's not the case, then we are in a whole different world, which is the world we are now inhabiting. And so we're going to see effectively contestation over the ability of institutions like the judiciary to hold the president and the powers of the executive in check.
Okay, so even suggesting that Canadians should start, examining what's going on down in the US, talking about the implications for Canada, maybe even considering the possibility that Trump would look north and maybe deploy troops across our border. Is that just too far? And I'm being alarmist, or is that the conversation we need to have?
Well, I think it is something that can't happen today, but only because Americans wouldn't allow it to happen effectively. That's the ultimate check. If the president were to feel like something would be in his interest and that he would not face opposition to a particular move, we simply can't assume that he wouldn't try it effectively. And so a place like Greenland might be subject to an early experiment in the willingness of Americans to push against some kind of geopolitical overreach by the president. And if we don't really see much pushback on that, then something like the Canadian North, which we simply cannot fully defend using our own military, we rely on cooperation to the United States to defend, then that suddenly looks much more vulnerable than it did when norms seemed to be firmly in place. And so that's the kind of thought process I think we do have to engage in. And then the question is, well, what can we do about it? And there are things that can hold the president to account in the United States, but we don't have a lot of say over that in terms of people pushing back and rising up to demand accountability of the presidency. And then beyond that, it's trying our best to secure our own ability to defend our claims to sovereignty and finding other allies who will also stand up with us. And that's the world we seem to be in now.
You know, you bring up Arctic sovereignty, and because China's interested in the Arctic, and Russia is already there and has been there for some time. Is it likely that uh, Donald Trump would look for areas where Canada is weak and probe those areas first, like the Arctic?
Or it may be that those are the kinds of things that an American administration feels is what they really want to focus on, and unexploited, untapped resources of the sort that we hear calls to exploit in places like Alaska right now in terms of additional energy exploitation and so on. So we don't really know, and I don't know that we even have any evidence of any kind of grand plan at this point to do this kind of exploitation. It is, and this will sound like a bit of a joke, and in some ways it is, but in some sense, the U.S. president is a bit like a Roomba, where there is no grand plan of vacuuming up power, but neither is there any kind of idea about stopping just because the Roomba is not supposed to go any further. It will stop and it will go until some sort of obstacle forces it to stop and turn in a different direction. And so we have ample evidence that this president, this administration, when checked, will go in a different direction. But the more that we see the lines of accountability and the constraints on power in the United States attenuated through these kinds of actions south of the border, more it makes us worry that the check won't happen within the United States. It will have to come from without.
Okay, so this raises an interesting question. If we're going to have a conversation about this, and I worry that Canada is reacting as opposed to getting out in front of this. We're always, oh, he did this. We weren't expecting that. Well, now what do we do? And as opposed to planning for the worst case scenario and doing whatever we can do. But that involves some kind of national conversation, where, it's in the media and people are aware of it. And even it seems like that possibility might be a trigger for Trump. So the very conversation of how do we protect ourselves might trigger the thing we're worried about.
I mean, it is a reality that when there is blunt and accurate talk about what this presidency amounts to, it can invite retribution. There's a piece in the New York Times today that is detailing legal experts' reactions to the first couple hundred days of the president's second administration, and effectively the majority say that they were surprised just how much worse it was than they expected. They are also unwilling to do so, attaching their names to it, and so that's the kind of world that we are in. So we have to find ways to have these conversations, but aware that it is an uncomfortable world where, particularly within the United States, there may be a reticence to invite retribution because there is an ample willingness to try to push back on anything that resembles a guardrail and a check on authority. And so the longer this situation lasts without a general pushback, the worse it's going to get. And Canada has to find a way to, I think, make it clear uh, what will lead to significant pushback so we don't see that kind of probing environment where we find ourselves in an escalatory environment.
Well, Stuart, I don't know what we can do other than continuing to talk about what Trump is up to south of the border at this point. Have conversations like this, and hopefully enough people will watch videos like this, news stories like this, that we begin to have some kind of a conversation about it. And maybe that's the best we can hope for. And that means probably we'll have you back in the very near future because this does not seem to be a story that's going to go away.
No, I think the things are going to continue to escalate in different ways in the United States. That it is clearly on a contentious track, to use a neutral term, and things may get worse before they get better again. So we don't know what the future holds, but it bears watching and, as you say, planning and not just reacting.
The last interview I had with you last week, you actually used the F word, fascism. And I don't know. Is this more evidence of the US, what we just talked about with the National Guards down in Oregon and California? Is this more evidence that the US is drifting towards fascism? And then,
In a situation like this, I think, as you say, the F word can generate a lot of heat and perhaps more heat than light. And so I would talk rather about the threat to democratic governance and international norms that the president represents. It's something we can describe in neutral terms that might not give the wrong impression because we associate a number of different tendencies with the idea of fascism historically, and there are some that are close analogs to what we're seeing today. In other cases, we might just be talking about the attacks on democratic accountability and a move towards a kind of proto-authoritarianism where we may still have elections in the United States, but there is not a robust set of freedoms for opposition members of society, such that those electoral contests are not really reflective of a full consolidated democracy anymore. And alongside that, we can also talk about the aims of the state to try to remove people seen as undesirable, and that's where we really do get into territory most reminiscent of fascism. But I think it's enough to say that we do see attacks on democratic guardrails. We do see attacks on international norms of reciprocity and essentially good neighborship, and that should be enough, even without a debate over what is and is not fascism, to inspire us to action.
okay, I promise this is going to be my last question. I don't know what proto-authoritarianism is, so I'm just going to stick with authoritarianism.
There you go.
And the question is, it, many trends that start in the United States eventually, you know, drift across the border, drift north across the border. And what's your take on the potential threat of that authoritarian trend showing up here in Canada?
Here, I do think we can take some solace in the fact that our institutions are constructed quite differently than the United States. When I say proto-authoritarian, I mean that we see a drive to beat down some of the democratic guardrails, but we also see pushback. We are seeing it perhaps later than we had hoped for, but we do see evidence of that in governorships of California and Oregon and elsewhere. So people are willing to protest and willing to push back. So we don't know where the U.S. is heading. We do know that there is this attempt to beat down opposition in the United States. In Canada, while we have some of the same cultural divides and cultural debates, we also have strong traditions of a things like a nonpartisan judiciary, a fusion of executive and legislative authority subject to the conventions of responsible government. So it is hard for an executive to effectively go rogue and try to consolidate power outside of the constraints of either the rule of law or democratic accountability, because those two things are in full operation in Canada to this moment. And it is hard to imagine an environment where we would see, so let's say, a prime minister able to consolidate power over considerable amount of time as we see in the United States. And so we do have our own guardrails, and they're not the same in all cases as the United States. But that said, we also will see continued pressure to try to fall in line with political innovations and imperatives coming out of the American political system, and we have to be I think, aware of and responding to that.
Stuart, thank you very much for this.
My pleasure, as always.